Eric Valen stood at the top of his penthouse, overlooking the city below. The skyline was a shimmering array of sleek glass and steel, a testament to the empire he had built. His fingers drummed impatiently on the cold stone of the balcony railing as he surveyed the bustling streets far below. Everything in his life had been meticulously planned, every step taken with precision. His rise to power had been fueled by his unrelenting ambition and his willingness to trample over anything or anyone that stood in his way. He had no time for weakness, no patience for people who couldn't keep up with his pace. His empire was the crown jewel of intergalactic commerce, and he would do whatever it took to keep it at the top. His gaze shifted to the figure standing silently by his desk, the only other person in the room. Alicia, the alien assistant he had always seen as little more than an employee, a tool to be used and discarded when needed. She had been with him for years, efficient, quiet, and obedient. Despite her race, she had never once questioned his orders or tried to push beyond her position. In Eric's world, people like her were invaluable, expendable, but essential nonetheless. Tonight was important. The gala was just a few hours away, an event that would cement his place among the most powerful leaders in the galaxy. High-profile dignitaries from both human and alien sectors would be in attendance. It was supposed to be a showcase of his influence, a carefully curated evening where he could cement his control over a vital trade deal. But as Eric turned his attention back to his assistant, his irritation began to grow. Alicia had been working diligently on the event, arranging everything, but there was something about her quiet demeanor tonight that rubbed him the wrong way. She was too passive, too invisible. He preferred people who were dynamic, people who could match his energy, his drive. Yet Alicia remained an enigma. Silent, unreadable, and in his mind, far too unimportant to be at the forefront of such a crucial event. "Are the final preparations set?" Eric asked, his voice sharp, but without much interest. Alicia nodded, her alien features as composed as ever. Her skin was a soft shade of violet, and her large eyes, reflective like mirrors, glistened in the dim light of the room. She had a quiet grace that seemed to go unnoticed by most, but Eric had always found her presence easy to ignore. She didn't demand attention the way others did, which was both a blessing and a curse in his eyes. "Yes, Mr. Valen," she replied, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "The guests are confirmed. The catering is ready, and the main hall is set up." "Good," Eric said with a dismissive nod, his gaze already shifting to the digital screen displaying the gala's guest list. "And don't forget, I expect you to be out of sight for most of the evening. You'll be handling the logistics behind the scenes, not mingling with the guests." Alicia's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't respond. It wasn't her place to argue. She had long since learned that her role was to assist, to stay in the shadows while Eric handled the spotlight. There was a certain calmness about her, something Eric couldn't quite decipher. He'd always attributed it to her alien nature, but now, standing so close to her, a strange feeling settled in his chest. It was almost as if she was different tonight. The evening began as expected. Smooth, polished, and efficient. Eric greeted guests, exchanged pleasantries with alien diplomats and human business magnates, all while keeping his composure. He felt the power he had worked so hard to amass at the tips of his fingers. He reveled in the atmosphere, the hum of excitement in the air, the clinking of glasses, and the sound of laughter. But somewhere, amid the formalities and rehearsed smiles, something didn't feel right. He couldn't pinpoint it at first. The night was going as planned. Everything was in order, but the tension lingered in the background. His mind wandered back to Alicia, who had remained quietly by the catering tables, moving between the various duties she had been assigned. She was always so efficient, so unobtrusive, almost to the point of being invisible. Yet tonight, he couldn't shake the thought that something was different about her. There was a quiet force to her presence now, an energy that felt unfamiliar and unsettling. And then, the moment arrived. One of the senior diplomats, an influential alien woman named Arlia, made a sudden announcement. She had been talking with Alicia earlier in the evening, And now, seemingly out of nowhere, Arlia called the room to attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Arlia's voice rang out across the grand hall. "I believe we have a guest among us who has a few words to share. Please welcome Alicia, Mr. Vallen's assistant." The room went silent, a murmur of surprise rippling through the crowd. Eric froze, his heart skipping a beat. He hadn't planned for this. Alicia was supposed to stay in the background. She wasn't part of the program, wasn't supposed to address anyone directly. But there she was, walking toward the center of the room, a confident yet understated presence in the midst of the lavish crowd. Eric felt his throat tighten. He was about to intervene to put a stop to this, but then something stopped him. Alicia reached the microphone. She took a deep breath and began to speak. "I know I wasn't invited to speak," she began, her voice steady but gentle. "But I feel there's something we all need to remember. In our pursuit of power, wealth, and success, we have lost sight of the one thing that can truly bring us together: compassion. If we want to move forward as a galaxy, as people, we must understand that the bonds between humans and aliens must be built on empathy, not just profit." The words were simple, but they hit Eric like a thunderclap. The room, once filled with casual chatter, fell into complete silence as her speech unfolded. Alicia spoke with the kind of calm authority that Eric had never expected from her. Her words were a quiet revolution, a challenge to the very core of his beliefs. It wasn't just her message. It was the way she conveyed it, the warmth in her tone, the genuine care in her eyes. For the first time, Eric felt like a stranger in his own empire. His carefully curated world, where power reigned supreme, began to feel unstable, as if the ground he had so confidently walked on was slipping from beneath him. The room was electrified, the tension palpable. Eric's mind raced. This was not part of the plan. Alicia had just challenged everything he believed in. And now the galaxy's most powerful leaders were looking to him, waiting for his reaction. But all he could do was watch. And in that moment, Eric realized with a sinking heart that he was no longer in control. As the gala continued, the damage was done. Eric's carefully built facade was cracked. His rivals, sensing an opportunity, began to turn their attention toward Alicia, her words stirring a movement he hadn't anticipated. His thoughts were clouded as the evening wore on, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The days following the gala felt like a blur to Eric. The attention on Alicia had only grown, her speech reverberating across the media, shifting public opinion, and stirring up an unexpected movement. Eric, who had built his empire on control and calculation, was losing his grip. Rivals who had once cowered under his influence now seemed emboldened, and the corporate landscape he had spent years perfecting was beginning to crack. He sat in his office, surrounded by sleek glass walls that gave him a perfect view of the city, but it felt distant now. The hum of his business was still there, but it was different. The power he had wielded so easily was slipping through his fingers, and in its place was the gnawing sensation of vulnerability. His assistant, Alicia, was always a step away, efficient, unobtrusive, and now, she was everywhere. The headlines, the talk shows, the political discussions, it all kept coming back to her words. He had underestimated her. Eric had dismissed her as a quiet, alien woman who knew her place. But now, it seemed that she had become something much larger, a symbol of what he feared most: change. He couldn't shake the image of her standing at the center of the gala, speaking to the crowd with such calm authority. It gnawed at him. How had she become the one to challenge everything he believed in? He had thought of her as nothing more than an assistant, someone who could be relied upon for the mundane tasks, someone who would never dream of stepping outside her role. But she had. And now, Eric was left reeling from the consequences. The meeting with his board of directors had been a disaster. They had watched Alicia's speech and seen the shifting tides in the political and business spheres. They weren't just talking about the potential profit anymore. They were discussing how Eric could regain control, how he could adjust his leadership style to appeal to the growing demand for more inclusive, empathetic business practices. It was the exact opposite of what he had built. "Mr. Vallen, you need to adapt." His chief financial officer, Morgan, had said during the meeting. His words were gentle, but Eric could hear the underlying criticism. If you don't act fast, others will. Your opponents are already courting the support of the alien delegates. They're using Alicia's message to leverage their position. You might be losing the upper hand. Eric had clenched his jaw, the words cutting deeper than any of his rivals' attacks. He had spent his entire career building his reputation as someone who didn't care about the emotions or opinions of others. He had built this empire through cold, ruthless strategies, and now he was being told to change by his own people, by his own company. After the meeting, Eric had retreated to his penthouse, hoping to clear his mind. The sleek walls and windows offered a sharp contrast to the chaos inside his head. He was used to control, to decisiveness, to being the one everyone turned to for answers. But right now, the only thing he could hear in the back of his mind was Alicia's voice. He had been pacing for what felt like hours when he received the message. A reminder from his assistant, Alicia, to attend a scheduled dinner with a group of important investors. It had been set up weeks ago, but he had no desire to go. The last thing he wanted was to smile and shake hands with the people who were now questioning his leadership. He looked at the clock, realizing he was running late. With a frustrated growl, he turned to leave the penthouse, the cold reality of the situation weighing on him. There was no choice now. He had to attend, had to try to salvage something from this mess. But the more he thought about the dinner, the more he dreaded it. There would be questions about the changes, about Alicia's influence, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could hide his uncertainty. The dinner was held at an exclusive restaurant, a place where only the most influential of people dined. As Eric walked in, he felt the eyes of the room turn toward him. The silence was almost deafening. The guests, all high-ranking business leaders and political figures, exchanged glances, as if waiting for him to say something, anything, to reassure them that he was still the same Eric Vallon they had always known. But Eric felt small, suddenly unsure of himself. His usual confidence, the sharp edge that had always set him apart, felt muted, replaced by a growing discomfort. His eyes scanned the room, finally landing on Alicia, who was standing off to the side, helping with the last of the dinner preparations. She wasn't supposed to be a part of this evening, but there she was, her presence undeniable. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, Eric couldn't look away. There was something different in her gaze now, a calm certainty, an unspoken understanding that unsettled him. She had become the unspoken force in his life, the one thing he could no longer control. He tore his gaze away, his pulse quickening, and walked toward the table where the investors were waiting. They immediately began with the questions, subtle at first, but their meaning was clear. Was Eric still in control? Could he regain his footing? Or was the change in the air something that he couldn't stop? The questions came fast, too fast for him to answer clearly. Every word felt like a trap. But before he could gather his thoughts, one of the investors, Kara Thorne, a powerful alien diplomat, spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "I've been following the developments closely, Mr. Vallon," she said, her tone both pointed and curious. "Your assistant's speech. It seems like a call for change, a shift in how we do business. I have to say, it's a refreshing perspective, though I'm curious how you plan to move forward with such ideals." Eric clenched his fists under the table. He could feel Alicia's presence, just behind him, and the weight of her influence pressing down on him. He didn't know how to respond. For the first time in his career, he felt like the man who had always been in charge was no longer certain of anything. After dinner, Eric retreated to his office, feeling drained. He ran his hands through his hair, staring at the wall in front of him as if it would somehow offer an answer. The investors had left, and the weight of their questions lingered like a shadow over him. And then, as if on cue, Alicia entered the room. She didn't ask for permission. She never did. It was just part of the dynamic between them. She was always there when he needed her, even if he hadn't acknowledged it before. "Mr. Vallon," she said softly, standing by the door. Her voice was measured, calm as always. "The investors are concerned. They're asking for a clear direction. They want to know what your next step will be. Eric didn't look at her at first. Instead, he stared at the papers scattered on his desk, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He wanted to lash out, to say something cruel, but instead, he found himself asking a question he hadn't expected. What would you do, Alicia? There was a long pause. Eric finally turned to face her, and for the first time, he saw her not as his assistant but as something far more significant. She was the one who had disrupted everything, and now, she was the only person left who seemed to have any answers. She met his gaze, her expression steady. I would listen. I would listen to the people around you, your allies, your enemies, even the ones you've dismissed. Her words were quiet, but they carried a weight that Eric couldn't ignore. You might find that the answers you're looking for are already in front of you. Eric stood there for a moment, the silence between them thick. Alicia had offered him a glimpse of something he hadn't considered, something more than power, more than control. For the first time, he wasn't sure what he wanted anymore. Eric didn't sleep that night. He paced the floors of his penthouse, the city's lights casting long shadows across the room. The words Alicia had said echoed in his mind, reverberating through his thoughts. You might find that the answers you're looking for are already in front of you. It was a strange thought, a thought he couldn't shake. He had always prided himself on his independence, his ability to make decisions, to command respect without needing anyone's help. But now, with the weight of his empire seeming to crumble around him, he found himself uncertain. Alicia, the quiet alien assistant he had so often overlooked, had become a symbol of something he couldn't control. She had challenged him in ways no one else had, and it left him unnerved. The next morning, Eric stood in front of the mirror, straightening his tie, trying to keep his thoughts focused on the day ahead. His schedule was packed with meetings, all designed to try to put out the fires that were slowly consuming his business. The board had given him an ultimatum: adapt or lose everything. They had made it clear that Alicia's rise had stirred something in the public, something he hadn't expected. Adapt? Eric muttered to himself, staring at his reflection. The word felt foreign, strange on his lips. Empathy, collaboration, these were the things his competitors had latched onto, using Alicia's influence to undermine him. He was supposed to be the one who dictated the future. He was the one people followed, not the one who followed. The door to his office opened, and Alicia stepped inside. She was as composed as ever, her violet skin reflecting the soft light of the morning. Her calm presence was almost unsettling now. He had never noticed how effortlessly graceful she moved, how her quiet confidence seemed to fill the room in a way that was both subtle and overpowering. Eric looked at her for a moment, resisting the urge to dismiss her as he normally would. There was something different about the way she held herself now, something more grounded. He felt a twinge of frustration rise in his chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. Mr. Vallon, she said, her voice soft but firm. You have a meeting with the Human Trade Delegation in an hour. I've arranged the documents for you. He nodded, trying to mask his unease. Thank you, Alicia, he said, his tone clipped. He could feel her gaze on him as she set the files down on his desk, the unspoken weight of her presence pressing against him. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he saw something in her gaze, something that made his heart beat faster. He quickly turned away, focusing on the documents before him, anything to avoid the strange pull he felt toward her. I trust everything is in order for today's meetings? He asked, his voice betraying a hint of unease. Alicia nodded, a small, knowing smile tugging at her lips. Everything is ready, Mr. Vallon. You have the power to decide the next step. But I would suggest listening carefully to your colleagues. They're more open to collaboration than you think. Her words struck him harder than any of his previous encounters with her. She wasn't just talking about business. She was talking about the way he handled people, the way he treated them. She was asking him to reconsider everything he had built, everything he thought he knew about leadership. Thank you, he said stiffly, forcing himself to focus on the files in front of him. You can go now. She lingered for a moment, as though considering something, and then nodded before turning to leave. But just before she stepped out, she stopped, as if something had held her back. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Mr. Vallon," she said quietly. Eric looked up at her, his heart suddenly racing again. The simplicity of her words seemed to hold a deeper meaning, one he wasn't sure he could understand. She left the room before he could respond, and once again, he was left alone with his thoughts, the weight of the situation pressing down on him more heavily than before. The meeting with the human trade delegation went as planned, but Eric couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. His usual confidence faltered as he found himself listening more than speaking, trying to gauge the reactions of the room. The other members of the delegation were more receptive than he had anticipated, more willing to consider his proposals. Yet there was something in the air, something that felt off. They weren't just negotiating business. They were negotiating his future. And he could see that the power had shifted from his hands, just slightly, but enough to make him uncomfortable. When the meeting ended, the delegates left, exchanging polite but thin smiles. As Eric walked back to his office, he couldn't help but replay the events in his mind. He was losing his grip. His empire, his carefully constructed world, was starting to slip through his fingers, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His thoughts turned to Alicia. She was the one constant now, the one person who seemed to know how to navigate this new world he found himself in. She had made him question everything: his leadership, his approach to business, his very identity. He had built his empire by outmaneuvering others, by staying one step ahead. But now he was unsure of the steps he needed to take. And all the while, Alicia remained an enigma. He couldn't figure her out, couldn't understand what motivated her. The days that followed were filled with more meetings, more attempts to regain control, but nothing seemed to work. Eric was always one step behind. He found himself more and more drawn to Alicia, even as he tried to push her away. She was everywhere now, her influence extending beyond just the office. Media outlets sought her out for interviews. Politicians used her words in their speeches. And the public, humans and aliens alike, looked to her as a symbol of hope, of change. Every time Eric tried to assert himself, to remind everyone who he was, it felt hollow. Alicia's quiet voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of what he had ignored for so long: the need for empathy, for connection. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. He had to confront her. Eric found Alicia in the hallway, just outside his office. She was speaking with one of the staff members, but as soon as she saw him, the conversation stopped. "Alicia," Eric said, his voice steady but firm, "I need to talk to you." She nodded and excused herself from the conversation. As she stepped closer, Eric felt his heart race again. There was something about her, something that pulled him in, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. "Mr. Vallon," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, "what can I do for you?" Eric took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began. "About listening, about adapting. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. This empire, my empire, feels like it's slipping away." Alicia's expression softened, and for the first time, Eric saw a flicker of something he hadn't noticed before: compassion. "Maybe you're not meant to hold on to everything, Mr. Vallon," she said quietly. "Maybe it's time to let go of control and start building something better, something that can last." Her words settled over him like a wave, and for the first time in days, Eric felt a spark of something new, a sense of possibility. The road ahead was uncertain, but maybe, just maybe, it wasn't about control anymore. Maybe it was about something else entirely. As they stood there, the weight of their words hanging between them, Eric realized that his journey wasn't just about business anymore. It was about something far deeper. And the person who had sparked that realization, the one who had opened his eyes, was standing right in front of him. Eric couldn't remember the last time he felt so vulnerable. Standing in his office, facing Alicia, the walls of his carefully constructed world seemed to collapse, one by one. He had always been the one in control, the one who dictated the direction of his business, the one who made decisions with sharp precision. But now, standing before her, he felt something else, something unsettling, Alicia didn't seem to notice his turmoil. Her presence was calm, almost serene, but there was an intensity in her eyes. She was watching him, waiting for him to make his move, to make the first step toward change. The thought struck him. She had been waiting for me to change, hadn't she? I know this is hard to accept, Alicia said softly, her voice a quiet strength in the charged silence. You've always been the one who controls everything. But sometimes, letting go is the first step towards something greater. Eric nodded slowly, his mind racing. Let go. The phrase echoed in his head, but he didn't know how to do it. How could he let go of everything he had worked so hard to build? The empire, the legacy, the power. How could he just relinquish it? But the idea of being trapped in this cycle, forever battling against forces that were stronger than him, was just as suffocating. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to consider a different path. Why me? Eric blurted out before he could stop himself. Why are you doing this? Helping me? Alicia's lips curved into a faint smile, one that was both kind and knowing. I'm not doing this for you, Mr. Valen. I'm doing it for all of us. You've been stuck in a place where everything you've worked for has become about control. But you've forgotten that people, all people, humans and aliens alike, work best when they're united, not divided. Eric clenched his jaw. She was right, of course. He had spent so many years building walls around himself, around his business, around his heart. Now the walls felt like they were crumbling beneath him. But even as his pride fought against it, there was a part of him that knew she was right. He needed to change. He had to change. But it was the how that eluded him. I don't know how to do this, Alicia, he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been in control for so long. It's hard to imagine letting go of it all. Her eyes softened, and she took a step closer. Her presence so reassuring, so grounded. It felt like she was the anchor he had been searching for. You don't have to let go all at once, she said gently. But you have to start somewhere. Start with the small things. Start with listening, with trusting, with leading through understanding. The words settled over him like a balm, soothing some of the rawness he felt inside. But there was a storm of doubt still raging within him. Could he really change? Could he truly let go of the parts of himself that had brought him this far? He wanted to believe he could, but the fear of failure, of losing everything, was overwhelming. I don't know if I'm ready, Eric said quietly, almost to himself. He could hear the uncertainty in his own voice, a sharp contrast to the confident man he once was. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He wasn't just afraid of change. He was afraid of failing, of losing control, of becoming someone weak. Alicia took another step forward, her expression soft but firm. You don't have to do this alone, Eric. Let me help you. Let me guide you through it. Her words were a lifeline, a promise of support he never thought he would need. But even as she spoke, a part of him wanted to pull away, to refuse the help. He had always been independent, always believed that he didn't need anyone else. But now, in the face of this vulnerability, he realized just how much he needed her, and how much he needed to let go of his old way of thinking. You've already helped me more than you know, Eric said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel a deep warmth spreading through his chest, a sense of gratitude and admiration that surprised him. He had never expected to feel this way, especially not toward someone like Alicia. She had been nothing more than an assistant, someone who worked for him, but now she was something more. She smiled, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. There was an unspoken connection between them, a bond forming that neither of them could deny. It was something neither of them could have predicted. Alicia had become more than just a guiding force. She had become something else entirely. You don't have to thank me, Eric, Alicia said, her voice gentle but full of resolve. This isn't about gratitude. It's about growth, about finding a way forward together. Her words sent a jolt of emotion through him, and Eric couldn't help but feel drawn to her in a way he hadn't expected. There was a tenderness in her gaze, an openness that made his heart ache. He had always believed that strength came from independence, from standing alone. But now, he wondered if true strength came from something else. From trusting, from vulnerability, from connection. The moment between them stretched on, a silence filled with unsaid words and unspoken feelings. Eric felt as if the world had stopped, as if the only thing that mattered was the woman standing before him. His heart was racing, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure what to do with himself. Alicia seemed to sense his turmoil, and after a beat, she spoke again, her voice soft but filled with purpose. You have a choice, Eric. You can keep fighting, keep holding on to everything that's slipping away, or you can let go, trust, and build something new. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, an invitation to step into the unknown. Eric didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't ready to walk away from this. From her. There was something about her, something that made him want to believe in a different way, a different future. He was scared, more scared than he had ever been. But there was a part of him, deep inside, that wanted to follow her, to trust her. I don't know what's going to happen next, Eric said, his voice filled with uncertainty. But I want to try. I want to see what happens when I do what you're asking. When I let go. Alicia's smile deepened, and there was a warmth in her gaze that made Eric's heart swell. That's all I'm asking, Eric. One step at a time. As she turned to leave, Eric watched her, the weight of her words still heavy on his heart. He didn't know where this journey would take him, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to do it alone. And for the first time in a long time, that thought didn't scare him. It gave him hope. The journey was just beginning, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that office all those weeks ago. Eric sat in his office, the weight of the last few days pressing down on him. It had been nearly a week since his conversation with Alicia, and things had already begun to change. Subtly but noticeably. He wasn't as quick to lash out in meetings, wasn't as impatient with the team. And most surprising of all, the board had started to shift their stance. They were still skeptical, still doubting his ability to turn things around. But there was a glimmer of hope, of possibility. But there was a catch. No matter how much he tried to deny it, there was still a growing tension between him and Alicia. Something unspoken that lingered in the air whenever they were in the same room. It was a quiet thing, a shared glance, a brush of shoulders as they passed in the hall. He felt it, a magnetic pull that he couldn't ignore, even though he wasn't sure what to do with it. Alicia, for her part, remained professional, focused on her work. She didn't push him, didn't make any overt gestures to indicate that she was aware of the change between them. She kept her distance, but it was a distance that only seemed to pull him closer. And in moments of quiet, when she wasn't looking, he found himself watching her, his thoughts trailing into dangerous territory. It wasn't that he didn't trust her, he did. Alicia had proven herself time and time again. Her sharp intellect and unshakable calm, a constant presence amidst the chaos. She had shown him how to listen, how to take a step back and consider the bigger picture. But something more was stirring inside him, something he hadn't expected. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Mr. Vallon, the team is ready for your presentation. Alicia's voice came from the other side, calm as ever. She always seemed to know exactly when he needed her. Thank you, Alicia, Eric said, his voice hoarse as he cleared his throat. He stood up from his desk, smoothing his suit. He needed to focus. This wasn't the time for distractions. But even as he walked toward the door, his mind kept drifting back to her. When he stepped into the conference room, the atmosphere shifted. The board members were already seated, and their expectant gazes met his as he entered. Alicia stood off to the side, quietly reviewing her tablet, but her presence felt larger than life. She was always calm, always composed. Eric nodded to her as he took his place at the head of the table, mentally preparing himself for the presentation. But as he started to speak, laying out his ideas and strategies for the upcoming quarter, he found himself faltering. The words didn't come as easily as they once had. His mind kept drifting to the way Alicia's eyes followed him when he spoke, the way she seemed to understand him without saying a word. The room was quiet, the board members listening intently, but there was something about the way they looked at him that made him self-conscious. They were waiting for him to fail, waiting for him to crumble under the pressure. It wasn't until Alicia's calm, steady gaze landed on him that he felt grounded again. She didn't see him as a failure. She saw him as someone capable of change. Taking a deep breath, Eric pushed forward. He spoke with more confidence, his words flowing more naturally now. He could feel the shift in the room. They were listening. He wasn't just talking to them, he was talking with them. After the presentation, the board members exchanged murmurs, their eyes calculating. They were still skeptical, but they couldn't deny that there was something different about him. They were beginning to see the potential, the possibility that he could turn things around. Eric let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The meeting had gone better than he had anticipated. But as he turned to leave, he felt a tug at his sleeve. He looked over to find Alicia standing beside him, her expression unreadable. "Good work today, Mr. Vallon," she said softly, her voice low and soothing. For a moment, he was speechless. He had expected to feel relief, but there was something more in her gaze, something that made his heart beat faster. "Thank you, Alicia," he said, his voice catching slightly. He took a step closer to her without thinking, as if drawn by some invisible force. "I couldn't have done it without you." Her smile was small but genuine. "You've done the hard work. I'm just here to help you see the path." She turned to leave, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't saying. He had always been good at reading people, and he could sense that something had changed between them. She was pulling away, keeping her distance, but the connection was still there. He couldn't explain it, but it was undeniable. The days following the meeting felt different. Eric had the sense that Alicia was keeping herself just out of reach, her focus entirely on her work. She still offered her guidance when needed, but it was clear that she was no longer as present in the way she had been before. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as the days went on, he couldn't ignore the growing gap between them. He found himself looking for moments to speak with her, to see if the connection was still there. But whenever they were together, there was an invisible wall between them, one that neither of them seemed willing to cross. It was maddening. One evening, after the workday had ended, Eric found himself pacing the halls of the building, unable to shake the feeling that something important was slipping through his fingers. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He stopped in front of Alicia's office door. The lights inside were still on, casting a soft glow through the crack beneath the door. He hesitated, wondering if this was the right thing to do. But before he could second-guess himself, he knocked softly. "Alicia?" he called out, his voice quieter than he intended. The door opened almost immediately, and she stood before him, her expression neutral but not unkind. "Mr. Vallon?" she said, her voice soft. I need to talk to you," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I don't know what's happening between us, but I can't ignore it anymore." Alicia's eyes flickered, and for the first time in a long while, Eric saw something unfamiliar there: vulnerability. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. As he walked into the room, the tension between them felt palpable. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Eric realized just how much he had been holding back, how much he had been avoiding. "Alicia, I don't know what this is," Eric began, his voice trembling slightly. "But I can't keep pretending it isn't there. I need to understand. I need to know what you're feeling." Alicia closed the door softly behind him, her gaze never leaving his. "What I'm feeling," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She took a deep breath before meeting his eyes again. "I think you already know, Eric." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in a long time, Eric felt a surge of hope mixed with uncertainty. This was the moment where everything could change. Eric stood in the center of Alicia's office, the weight of her words settling heavily in the air between them. He had hoped for a moment of clarity, a resolution to the unspoken tension that had been building between them. But now that they were finally facing it, he wasn't sure what to do next. Alicia's eyes held a quiet intensity, her expression unreadable, but there was something about her posture, slightly closed off yet not entirely distant, that made Eric's heart race. She hadn't answered him. Instead, She simply met his gaze with an almost searching look, as if she, too, was trying to decipher the words they were both afraid to speak. I think you already know, Eric, she repeated, her voice soft yet firm, as though she were placing the responsibility of understanding squarely on his shoulders. He swallowed, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He had never been the kind of man to hesitate, to second-guess himself. In the business world, hesitation was weakness. But here, now, with Alicia, he felt like a novice. He felt out of his depth. She was different. She had always been different. Unlike anyone he had ever worked with, unlike anyone he had ever truly allowed to get close. Alicia, he took a step closer, then paused, his hands slightly shaking. I don't want to pretend this isn't there anymore. Not between us. Her lips parted, and for a brief moment, he thought she might say something, but she closed them again, a flicker of something passing over her face. She seemed to be weighing her next words carefully, choosing them with precision. Eric, you're changing. I see it. But I need you to understand something. This is more than just business. You're asking me to trust you in a way I haven't before. It's not just about work anymore, she said, her voice a mix of caution and sincerity. And that's not something I can simply decide in a moment. A knot formed in his stomach at her words, and for a brief instant, he almost wanted to retreat, to run from this vulnerable conversation. It was easier to stay in control, to keep things professional, to keep his walls up. But he had already let them down once, and Alicia had seen something in him that no one else had. She had seen past his ambition, past his coldness. I don't expect you to decide anything right away, Eric said, his voice quieter now, the uncertainty more apparent. But Alicia, I can't keep pretending that I don't feel it. This thing between us, whatever it is, I just need to know if you feel the same way. She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering away from him for just a moment. I don't know if I can answer that for you. Not yet. What I do know is that you're right. Something has changed. But I don't want either of us to rush into something we're not ready for. You've spent so long building this empire. Don't let it be built on things you don't fully understand. Her words struck a chord deep within him. She was right. He had spent years focused on success, on power, on control. And now, facing the strange new vulnerability with her, he didn't know how to balance it all. He didn't know how to let go of the part of him that had always been so driven by ambition. But don't you see? Eric said, his voice softening, almost pleading. I'm not the same person I was when we started working together. I'm changing because of you. You've made me see things differently. I don't want to go back to the way I was. Alicia looked at him then, her gaze unwavering, and for a long moment, there was silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, as if they were both aware that they were standing at a crossroads. You don't have to go back, Eric, she said quietly. But you have to be sure of what you want. It's not just about me. It's about everything you're building. And you can't lose sight of that. I can't let you lose sight of it. Eric took another step closer, the pull between them undeniable. He didn't want to back away, not now. And what if I want both? He asked, his voice low, as if he were daring her to answer. For a moment, her gaze softened, and he thought he saw something flicker there. Something that spoke to the vulnerability she had been guarding all along. But then, as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by the calm, measured control she always seemed to wield so effortlessly. I think you need to learn how to balance both, she said simply, a note of caution in her voice. And you need to do it for yourself, not just because you think I expect it. Eric nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. This was more than just about the two of them. This was about him, about who he was becoming. It was about the choices he would make moving forward. Alicia stepped back, glancing at the clock on the wall, and Eric knew that their conversation was coming to an end. I should get back to work, she said, her tone returning to its usual professional detachment. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words died on his tongue. He didn't want to push her further, didn't want to risk making her retreat even more. Instead, he gave a slight nod and turned to leave, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure where they stood now. He wasn't sure what the future held. But one thing was clear, he couldn't go back to who he had been. Not after what Alicia had shown him. Not after seeing himself through her eyes. The next few days were a blur for Eric. Work was overwhelming, the pressure from the board still hanging over him like a dark cloud. But even amidst the chaos, he couldn't stop thinking about Alicia, about her words, about the way she had looked at him when he had confessed how he felt. But things hadn't changed. Not really. She was still distant, still wrapped in the same professional armor she had always worn. He couldn't help but wonder if he had pushed her too far, too fast. The day after their conversation, he found himself walking into her office again, his nerves tighter than he cared to admit. This time, he wasn't sure what he was looking for. He wasn't sure if he even had the right to ask for more. When he entered, Alicia was sitting at her desk, typing something on her tablet. She didn't look up immediately, but the slight shift in her posture told him that she knew he was there. "Eric," she said without turning around. "What can I do for you?" He hesitated, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Alicia, I just wanted to check in. See how you're doing." She paused, and for a moment, he thought she might tell him to leave to give her space. But instead, she looked up, her eyes meeting his. There was a softness there, an openness that hadn't been present before. "I'm doing fine," she said. Her voice steady, but there was a flicker of something more beneath it. "And you?" Eric smiled, though it felt a little forced. "I'm figuring things out." Alicia nodded, a small but genuine smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Good. That's all anyone can do." And for the first time in a long time, Eric felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be heading in the right direction. Eric sat in his office late into the evening, the soft hum of the city below offering little comfort against the growing unrest inside him. His thoughts circled back to Alicia. How much had changed between them in such a short time. Yet, despite his efforts to bridge the gap, despite everything he had been willing to do for her, there was still a wall. And now, it wasn't just a matter of professional distance. It was something deeper, something personal. His mind kept replaying their last conversation. Alicia's words were still fresh in his ears. "You need to learn to balance both." It wasn't just about work anymore. It was about who he was, and who he was becoming in the process. Eric knew he couldn't keep burying his feelings behind boardroom negotiations and corporate goals. Alicia had made him confront the truth he had been avoiding for so long, that the life he had been building was empty without connection, without the kind of human warmth that came only when someone truly trusted you. But trust was something he had never given easily, not even to himself. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, his thoughts lost in a maze of possibilities. Was it too late to undo the damage he'd done? Was he too far gone to rebuild what he had so casually broken in the past? The door to his office clicked open, and Eric turned, expecting his assistant to walk in with another set of reports. But it wasn't his assistant. It was Alicia. She was dressed in a simple blouse and trousers, her dark hair falling loosely around her shoulders. The professional distance that usually defined her presence had softened, though it still held a kind of guarded elegance. She looked at him for a moment before speaking, as though searching for the right words. "You've been working late again," she remarked, her voice gentle but not without concern. "You should take a break." Eric stood up slowly, meeting her gaze with a mixture of uncertainty and determination. "I can't stop thinking about you, Alicia," he said, his voice rough but steady. "About us." Her eyes flickered briefly, an unreadable expression crossing her face. She crossed the room and leaned against the edge of his desk, arms crossed, but she didn't move away. "Eric," she said softly, "we've been through this." "I know," he replied, his voice more intense now. "But I can't ignore how I feel anymore. I don't want to keep pretending I'm just focused on work. You've made me realize that there's more than just ambition and power." Alicia didn't respond immediately. She watched him carefully, her eyes searching for something in him. Something he wasn't sure he could give her yet. But he was ready to try, to show her the side of himself he had long kept hidden. "I want to be better for you," he continued, the words coming more easily now. I want to understand what it means to have someone beside me. Not just someone to manage, not someone to control, but someone I can build with. Someone I can trust, Alicia. Her expression softened at his words, but there was still hesitation in her eyes. Eric, this isn't something that can be rushed. You can't just decide to change and expect everything to fall into place. You've spent your whole life living one way. It's not going to be easy to let go of that. He stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. I don't want to hold on to it anymore. I want to grow. I want to be more than just the man I've always been. You've made me realize that. He paused, searching her face for any sign of the warmth he had seen before, when they had talked so honestly. I just need you to believe me. Alicia looked away for a moment, her gaze falling to the floor as she processed his words. It was as if she were weighing the sincerity in his tone, trying to discern whether this was just another fleeting impulse or something deeper. Finally, she met his eyes again, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of something vulnerable beneath it. I believe you, she said softly. But that doesn't mean I can just let you into my life again. I've worked hard to create boundaries, Eric. I can't just throw them away. Not when I'm still figuring out who I am, too. He nodded, understanding her hesitation, though the knot in his chest remained. I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking you to let me in. Slowly, if you need. But I don't want to stand on the outside anymore. I want to be part of your world. I want to be someone who supports you. Not just in work, but in everything. In whatever this is between us. There was a long silence, the weight of his words hanging heavily between them. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alicia seemed to be considering what he had said, weighing the future of whatever it was they were building. Finally, she let out a soft breath. I don't know where this is going, Eric. I don't even know where I want it to go. But I won't shut you out. I'll give you the chance to prove that you mean what you say. A sense of relief washed over him, but it was mingled with a deep, unshakable anxiety. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be fast. But it was a start. I won't let you down, he said, his voice low and steady. I promise. Alicia's gaze softened just a little, a flicker of something vulnerable passing between them. She didn't say anything more, but the tension in the room shifted. She uncrossed her arms and took a step closer, her hand lightly brushing against his arm. For a fleeting moment, Eric felt the warm weight of her touch, the connection that had eluded them for so long, settling into a quiet understanding between them. I'll hold you to that, she whispered, her voice soft but firm. And in that moment, Eric realized that this, whatever it was between them, wasn't about quick fixes or easy answers. It was about trust, about giving himself permission to be vulnerable, to let someone else in when all he had known for so long was how to build walls. It wasn't going to be a smooth path, and it wasn't going to be simple, but it was something he was willing to fight for. As Alicia slowly withdrew from his side, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were only just beginning. And despite all the uncertainty that lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wouldn't give up on this, on her, no matter what it took. Eric woke early the next morning, his mind buzzing with the events of the previous evening. He had slept little, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Alicia and the quiet, yet significant conversation they had shared. The words they exchanged echoed in his mind. But now, there was a sense of urgency and understanding in his chest. He had made a promise to her, and though it wasn't much, it was the beginning of something new, something fragile that he was determined to protect. He dressed quickly and left his apartment, heading straight for the office. The morning air was sharp, the kind of coolness that made him feel alive and sharp with purpose. Yet, despite his outward focus, his thoughts kept circling back to her. He had promised her change, promised to be better, and while that was still a daunting prospect, he realized he could no longer hide from it. When he arrived at the office, he found himself pacing in his office, impatient. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, desire, but not for power, not for wealth. It was something else entirely. It was a desire for connection, for meaning, the kind of deep, human connection he had denied himself for too long. As the morning passed, Eric found himself distracted. His assistant, Clara, came in with the day's reports, but he barely registered them. His mind was elsewhere, thinking of Alicia, wondering if she had meant it when she said she would give him a chance. It had been a small promise, but it was the first step. His first step towards something greater than himself. Around mid-morning, there was a knock on his door. Alicia entered, her usual composed demeanor intact. But there was something different in her presence now. Something more relaxed, less guarded. She had come to work, but it was clear that she hadn't forgotten their conversation. "Good morning," she said, her voice soft, but with an undertone of warmth that made his heart beat just a little faster. "Morning," Eric replied, standing up as she walked in. "How are you?" She glanced at him for a moment before responding, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Better. Things aren't perfect, but I'm doing okay." The words were simple, but there was an unspoken understanding in them. They both knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but it was a start. "I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about yesterday," Eric said, stepping toward her. He stopped short, unsure of how to proceed. They were treading carefully, both hesitant to push too hard, too fast. "And I wanted to say, again, that I'm committed to making this work. I'm committed to being someone you can trust." Alicia looked at him for a long moment, as if measuring his sincerity. Her brow furrowed slightly, and she crossed her arms, a quiet strength emanating from her. "I believe you, Eric, but trust isn't built in a day. It's not something you can just will into existence. You have to earn it, day by day." He nodded, taking her words to heart. "I know. I'm not asking for immediate results, but I am asking for the opportunity to prove myself." For a moment, there was silence between them, the weight of their conversation hanging in the air. Then Alicia uncrossed her arms, her posture softening. She tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching his face, as though deciding whether to speak her mind. "You're right," she said, her voice quiet but certain. "You've been different since yesterday, and that counts for something. I need time. Time to figure out what this is. What we are." Eric swallowed, his throat tight. "I'm not going anywhere, Alicia. I'll be here, no matter how long it takes." The words felt heavier than he intended, but it was the truth. He wasn't running from this, not anymore. Alicia nodded, her lips curving into a slight smile. "Thank you. But just so you know, it's not just about you proving yourself. I have my own things to work through too. I don't want to hold back, but I also don't want to rush into something that isn't right. We have to both be ready for whatever this could be." Eric smiled softly. "I understand, and I'll wait. Whatever you need." She held his gaze for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a mutual respect and understanding. Then, with a nod, she turned toward the door. "I'll let you get back to work. We'll talk more soon." "Take care, Alicia," he called as she left the room. As she closed the door behind her, Eric felt an unfamiliar sense of peace settle over him. There were no grand promises or bold declarations, just a shared understanding of what lay ahead. Uncertainty, but also hope. Hope for something new. The next few days were a blur of meetings and reports, but Eric found himself with a new sense of focus. His work was no longer just about driving results or winning deals. He found himself thinking about Alicia, about their future, about what it meant to be truly present. He began to reach out more to the people around him, those he had once considered tools in his quest for success. He found himself listening more, taking time to understand their perspectives, and valuing their input. It was a small change, but it felt monumental. For the first time, Eric saw the value in relationships beyond the professional realm. One afternoon, as he sat in a meeting with a potential client, Eric caught a glimpse of Alicia through the glass wall of his office. She was sitting at her desk, typing away on her computer, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her presence was a quiet strength, a reminder that he wasn't doing this alone. They were on this journey together, even if it was just the beginning. After the meeting, he walked over to her office. She looked up as he approached, her expression softening when she saw him. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe. How's your day going? Busy, she replied with a smile. But good. Eric took a step closer, his voice lowering. I've been thinking about what you said. About earning trust, about proving myself. Alicia looked up at him, her gaze steady. And I've realized something. Trust isn't just about promises. It's about actions. And I want to show you through my actions that I'm not the same man I was before. Her eyes softened, and she smiled faintly. That's a good start, Eric. In that moment, Eric felt a sense of relief wash over him. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt that the road was worth traveling. The days that followed were filled with a quiet, steady transformation. Eric's actions, small but intentional, spoke louder than any words ever could. He was no longer just the ambitious, self-centered business magnate he had once been. His focus shifted, not solely to numbers and deals, but to the people around him, to Alicia, and to the changes he had promised himself he would make. His relationship with Alicia, still cautious, was evolving. There were no grand declarations, no sweeping gestures. Instead, it was the quiet moments that meant the most. The shared glances, the way he began to trust her judgment, the way she would offer him a soft smile when he least expected it. One morning, Eric stood in front of the large floor-to-ceiling window of his office, staring out at the city below. He could see the sprawling skyline, the pulse of life beneath him. He had always viewed this as his kingdom, his domain. But now, standing there, it felt different. He felt more connected to it, more connected to everything outside the cold glass walls of his empire. Alicia's words echoed in his mind, you need to balance both. He understood now. His ambition wasn't something he had to abandon, but it wasn't the only thing that mattered. He could be a leader not just in the boardroom but in life. There was a knock on the door, and Eric turned to find Alicia standing there, a soft smile on her lips. You're up early, she remarked, stepping into the room. I couldn't sleep, he replied, his tone lighter than usual. I was thinking about everything. Alicia raised an eyebrow, but the smile didn't fade. About what, exactly? Eric's gaze softened as he looked at her. About how much I've changed. About how much I still need to change. And about you. She crossed the room and leaned against the edge of his desk, her arms crossed. That's a lot to think about, but you don't have to change everything at once. I know. Eric let out a small, self-deprecating laugh. But I've come to realize that if I want anything to last, I have to start by building something real. With you. Her expression softened at his words, but she didn't respond immediately. There was a quiet tension in the air, a space between them that had once been filled with doubts, but now felt like an opportunity. I'm not perfect, Alicia, Eric continued, his voice low. I've made mistakes. I've hurt people and I've hurt you, but I want to make it right. I want to show you that I can be the person you need me to be. Alicia's gaze softened, her posture relaxing as she stepped closer. And I'm willing to give you that chance, Eric. But you need to understand that it's not about what I need. It's about us, about how we build this together. For the first time in a long time, Eric felt truly vulnerable. But he also felt something else, a deep, growing connection, a sense of possibility. It wasn't just about business or ambition. It was about something deeper, something more profound than he had ever expected. I want to build this with you, he said, his voice steady now, full of purpose. And I want to be better. For you, for me, for us. Alicia's smile widened, though there was still an edge of caution in her eyes. We're not there yet, Eric, but we're getting closer. Eric nodded, understanding. This wasn't something that could be rushed. It wasn't about an instant fix. It was about the slow, patient work of building trust and connection. In the days that followed, their relationship deepened, though it remained cautious. They spent more time together, not just working side by side in the office, but also sharing moments of laughter, moments of silence, and moments of understanding. They were beginning to learn how to navigate each other's boundaries and dreams, finding common ground in places where they had once been worlds apart. There were still obstacles, still moments of doubt and fear. Eric's past still lingered in the background, a shadow that sometimes threatened to pull him back into old habits. But each time he faltered, Alicia was there. Not as a savior, but as a steady presence. She didn't fix him, but she gave him the space to grow, to learn, and to be better. And that, in itself, was a kind of redemption. One evening, after a particularly difficult meeting with an international partner, Eric found himself in a quiet corner of the office, staring out at the city lights. The weight of the day was heavy, but the sense of accomplishment was even heavier. It had been a hard day, but it had been one of the first days he truly felt that he was leading with integrity, not just with authority. Alicia appeared beside him, her presence grounding him in a way no one else could. She didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply stood there, offering her quiet support. "I didn't think I could get here," Eric said softly, his eyes still on the city below. "I didn't think I could change, but I'm starting to believe I can." "You can," Alicia replied, her voice steady and warm. "But you have to keep working at it. Every day. And you can't do it alone." He turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I don't want to do it alone. Not anymore." She smiled, her eyes reflecting something that was deeper than just understanding. Something that spoke of trust, of respect, and perhaps even more. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice soft but certain. "But you'll have to keep showing up." Eric nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. There was no magic solution, no instant fix. But there was something real, something worth fighting for. And in that moment, standing there with Alicia by his side, Eric knew that he had already begun the most important transformation of his life. It wasn't just about the empire he had built. It was about the life he was learning to live. A life where he could be truly present, truly vulnerable, and truly himself. And for the first time, Eric felt a sense of fulfillment that had nothing to do with business, wealth, or power. It was the fulfillment that came from building something meaningful with someone who saw him for who he truly was, and who was willing to walk with him on the uncertain, yet hopeful, path ahead.